Okay, I think we're going to get started. So thank you all for being here tonight. We are super excited about our three panelists and the questions that we've gathered for them. So please put any additional questions you have in the Q&A chat box because we have some designated time to go through audience questions too. So we're really excited to get to those. So throw those in the Q&A box whenever they come to you. And then our project partner, Ben, is going to help monitor that. And then also a big thank you to Sojus for helping us host this event. And before I get any further in introducing ourselves and our panelists, I'd like to start with the CSU Land Acknowledgement Statement. Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and people. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly, that our founding came at a dire cost to the Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built on. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. So first, I'll quickly introduce the group. My name is Audrey Beatty, and my project partners are Ben Platt and Matt Twyman. We are all students in the GES 520 class, Issues in Global Environmental Sustainability, taught by Dr. Lockwood. And then much more importantly, our panelists, which I'll introduce from left to right, starting with Carol Dollard, who is an energy engineer in facilities management and co-chair of the President's Sustainability Commission at Colorado State University. In her 22 plus years at CSU, she has helped make university operations more sustainable. These efforts include 21 photovoltaic installations totaling over 6,800 kilowatts, 3 LEED Platinum and over 20 LEED Gold buildings, and over $15 million of energy and water efficiency projects. In addition, she leads a team that conducts the university's annual greenhouse gas inventory and produces biannual updates to the CSU Climate Action Plan. Next up is John Phelan, who is the Energy Services Senior Manager for the Fort Collins Utilities, leading the team that provides energy efficiency, conservation, demand response, and renewable energy services. His responsibilities include planning, implementation, and evaluation of the utility's energy policy and related programs. He also supports Fort Collins renewable energy, green building, climate, and sustainability initiatives. Mr. Phelan has a long history of association with related fields of energy efficiency, engineering, and architecture. He has a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Colorado Boulder and a Bachelor of Science in Conservation of Natural Resources from the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Phelan is a registered professional engineer in the state of Colorado. And last but certainly not least, Josie Platt. Josie is Associate Director for the Institute for the Built Environment at CSU, where she guides companies, municipalities, and organizations through developing capacity and action plans for regeneration and sustainability. Her work spans domestic and international projects and organizations across a variety of scales, including buildings, master plans, municipal programs, community coalitions, and organizational development. She holds a degree in sustainable enterprise from Fort Lewis College and a master's of construction management with an emphasis in sustainable building at Colorado State University. We are super thankful to all of our panelists for joining us tonight, and that will not be the first time I say that, but we are just super appreciative that they all volunteered to be here. And now that you know who they are, we want to quickly frame our discussion for tonight's panel. So the Fort Collins Action Plan calls for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 from 2005 levels, with 35% of those reductions coming from the building sector. And we really wanted to talk about building energy because while it's super important to climate action and sustainability planning, it's not necessarily the poster child of sustainability. It's not necessarily the first thing people think about. But buildings make up 40% of US electricity use. And in Fort Collins, buildings account for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a super important aspect of sustainability. And tonight, we just hope that this panel helps fill in some gaps in understanding and helps give some context for what we can all do moving forward in the building energy space. So with that, I will stop sharing and we will get to the first question, which I will pull up right now. And so our first question of the panel is, what does building energy mean to you? What kind of things are involved in building energy beyond just what is related to our utility bill or what the average citizen might think of when they think of building energy?
John, I think you should get to start with that one.
Okay, I'll do my best. I think when I think of building energy, there's concepts, of course, that pop up like efficiency and conservation, but also the flip side of like waste falls in, like wasting energy, and underneath those are really values that we hold. And I think we don't often think of building energy as representing our values, but in some ways, to me, it does. And we'll get into more, I'm sure, as the conversation goes, but energy's really an invisible and amorphous concept. Efficiency even more so. Like, you can't point to efficiency and look at it, hold it or touch it. And so it's really the outcomes of using energy that we care about. So we care about, there's the classic, people want their pizza warm and their beer cold. That all comes from energy. And the vast majority of people don't want to think about how efficient it is to make that warm pizza or cold beer. And yet those are the kinds of things that I certainly think about, probably too much. But anyway, I'll kick it off with that. And since Josie tagged me, I'm going to tag Josie back then.
So good role reversal here. Thinking about energy as a manifestation of values and culture is certainly part of how I think about building energy, but there's also just sort of the nuts and bolts of it, right? So it's, how is energy produced? How many people understand, or how do you think about, where does it come from? Most of our energy comes from fossil fuels, so coal and oil, that were the relics of, eons past. And so there's the production, increasingly moving towards renewable energy sources as production. And then there's the transmission, so how it moves through the place the energy is produced, and then there is the transmission that goes across the power lines. As John was referring to, there's waste that happens in that process. So we actually lose a lot of waste from the place the energy is made to it getting to the building. And then once it's inside of the building, it's all the things that we're using. So, the lighting, the heating, the cooling, everything that we plug into the walls, the movement, a lot of times of, depending on the building, your water and things like that. So building energy is really this whole system of extraction, transmission, and end uses that's embedded within this bigger frame of our culture and our society and infrastructure. So Carol, how are you going to add to that?
Okay, well, I'll just say ditto. No, it's like a couple of things come to mind. First of all, based on that original slide, part of my intro is I helped do the greenhouse gas footprint for Colorado State University. And just for the record, between electricity and natural gas, it's actually 80% of the footprint of Colorado State University. Commuting and air travel are important, but the other things are all pretty small. So it's all about building energy. So we think about building energy a lot. And like John said, and I think Audrey said, it's not sexy. It's not stuff people gravitate to, but it's 80% of our footprint. If we're going to make our footprint go away, we better focus on energy. But I think Josie said it best, you know, it's the lights, it's the heating and air conditioning, but it's also the stuff we plug in. And I think COVID has definitely shown us that we have buildings on campus that frankly don't really care if there's people in them or not. Yeah, we can turn the lights off, but they've got fume hoods. You know, if there's 2 researchers in that building doing COVID research or 100 like we were pre-pandemic, the building pretty much operates the same. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We didn't really design our buildings to operate mostly empty. And if you think about it in a pre-pandemic brain, why would we, right? You don't want to why would I build a building if I didn't plan on anybody being in it, right? And so we didn't do a very good job of that. And our buildings did not turn down as well as we had hoped. And so we're learning a lot about building energy when there's very few people in them. And then finally, I just want to say, energy also relates to how people get to those buildings. And the best example of that, and John and Josie will giggle because they know I'm speaking from personal experience. You can have the most sustainable, most net zero house on the planet. And if it's 20 miles outside of town, you definitely do not have a zero energy lifestyle or a zero carbon lifestyle because you got to get from point A to point B. So it's really important where we build our buildings and how we build our communities, and are they walkable and bikeable? And does everybody have to get in a car from point A to point B? Yeah. And that's an important part because that's energy too. So that's an important piece of the puzzle we shouldn't miss. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, before we go on to the next question, I think it's come up. I mean, it's really about systems, and but you can draw the boundaries. You know, the engineer can draw boundaries around like the footprint of the building, and you know how's that system working. But if we really want to understand it, there's everything from how did everybody that's in the building get there, and what are their activities, or where did the energy come from? But oftentimes you can boil a lot down to how much do you use and where does it come from? So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Matt, I think, has our next question.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so when I've been thinking about this and we were trying to put this together, one of the things we were trying to get at is, you know, we all live in our homes. We're there every day. We're making these decisions, but we all really need to kind of try to step out of that in some way. And I guess the question for y'all, with the expertise you have and all the time invested in all of this, is just kind of how do you think about building energy differently? You know, if you were to ask one, or if one of us were to ask you, you know, like, what should I be thinking about? I guess it's kind of like I imagine you think of it in a different way than we probably do in our day-to-day lives.
I don't know if that's, I'll take a stab at that. That's a tough one because as Josie and John know, I'm a nerd to the core. So I've thought about energy. Okay, I built a solar panel for a high school project. So it's been a while. Been doing this stuff a long time. So when I think about energy, I guess the thing that's imperative for people who don't think about energy all the time, like some of us do, is that you really understand, let's just say, your footprint. So where does your energy come from? What's the most impactful thing you can do? You know, it takes a little bit of homework to figure out, you know, where your electricity comes from, how much natural gas you're doing, how much commuting you're doing. But if you are really trying to save the planet and you say, I'm going to build a compost pile, well, that's great. And it'll really help your garden. And I have a ginormous compost pile at my house because I garden a lot. But you know what? Compost piles will not save the planet from carbon. It's a very tiny part of our footprint compared to fossil fuels, transportation fuels, that kind of stuff. So understand, if you're really trying to shrink your footprint, understand where your biggest impact can be. And that that just takes educating yourself. It's like I said, if you think you're going to do it through recycling and solid waste, I'll just say right now, you're wrong. And not that that's not important, but that if you really want to do climate change, it's not through recycling. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm sure
Who's
there's
gonna
a
call
few.
him?
I was gonna say, I'm sure, I can hear a few people being like, oh.
Yeah, and it's hard. And I always joke
it's the real honesty,
because recycling is a very tactile, and composting. You know, I can decide where to put my waste and I can really have control over that. But you know what? In terms of really reducing the climate problem that we have, that's not it. It's, you got to get out of your car. You got to make your house more efficient. You got to make better choices. You got to make hard choices. And it can even be, we can even get into things that you buy, you know, and that's way off topic. So I'll stop there and let John or Josie take it.
I think one way that I certainly think differently about it is just paying attention. I think that from what I know of my own family and friends, and well, not some of my friends because I know Carol too, but you know, really don't pay attention to. It's like the energy they use is a very, very small slice, if at all. So we have information, you know, from surveys and things like that, whether it's local or national, that like as a utility, people spend like 6 minutes a year paying attention to their electricity use. And that's probably only because they paid their bill, but most of them are even on auto pay now. So it's probably gone down from 6 minutes to something less. And in some ways I can understand that because it's not the forefront of most people's thinking. But it doesn't take very much attention to make a pretty substantial difference. You know, we see people, you know, when we do an efficiency project, if you can get to sometimes 10 or 20% savings, like that's a pretty good project to get that out of. I know people that can save 10% in their house just by a minimal amount of paying attention to things. And so that's one way. I'm going to think some more about it and hand it off to Josie because I'm sure there's other things, but a little attention goes a long way. So.
You know, John, I'm going to actually have to stop going after you. Clearly, we actually think about buildings more similarly than even I realized. So you know, culture and paying attention were, you know, two of the points that I'd made in my prep. But where I'll go with this question is thinking about the notion of thermal comfort and how people think about being too warm or too cold, and then what it actually means and what's comprised of it. So a lot of times on your thermostat, folks just look at the air temperature, right? And so they want the air temperature to be somewhere between 70 and 73 in general. But there are a lot of factors that go into how comfortable we feel. And you can, if you understand that, it actually empowers you to make different choices about how you use energy in your home. So the other factors include air movement. So that works for you or against you. When air is moving, you feel cooler in general because you've got respiration happening across your skin. So use air movement in the summer to help you feel cooler. It doesn't cool the air to have a fan on. You just feel cooler because there's air moving over you. And at the same time, if you have drafts or you have, you know, windows open, you know, and there's movement happening, then you might feel cooler. So that's one way. You know, what are you wearing? Folks want to go around in, you know, flip-flops and shorts and tank tops in the wintertime. Certainly how much you wear and how much physical activity you have will have a lot to do with how comfortable you are. A lot of times I'll use something as simple as like a rice bag and heat it up in the microwave and put that on my lap. And now I don't have to heat the whole house to stay warm. I can just have that warm, radiant heat right where I want it and need it. And then I don't have to heat up as much space. So sometimes when we understand different ideas about what helps us to be comfortable in a space, it empowers us to be able to make choices to save energy, which is kind of an extension of what John was saying about just paying attention, being mindful, managing your space, right? So opening your windows at night in the summer and then closing them down first thing in the morning, close down the shades in the morning. And you can do a lot to manage it if you're, again, just kind of being mindful and paying attention and thinking about how your house is actually working. You don't necessarily have to spend money and can often save money to save energy.
Those are all great points. It kind of makes me think about one of the discussions we were having offline was kind of, you know, there's homeowners and there's renters. And I think a lot of people think, well, I'm a renter. What can I do? I can't add solar panels to my apartment. I can't, you know, do all these expensive changes. And maybe what's kind of lost in the discussion is like Carol, you brought up with the conservation versus efficiency, which I think is a key point that I'd appreciate you stressing to some people. It's a big distinction.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, when they sent the questions ahead of time, there was a question related to energy conservation. I said, I think you mean efficiency, and I'm just going to say it as quickly as I can. But as energy nerds, and I wear my nerddom with pride. And energy efficiency is more about buying efficient equipment and improving the performance of a building, but it's about things. It's about making things more efficient. Whereas energy conservation is about behavior. So if I can get you to turn off a light switch or not leave your laptop on all the time, or put your phone charger on a power strip and turn off that power strip at night, so your charger's not, you know, using a few watts unnecessarily. That's behavioral changes, which, by the way, I'll throw in my 10% for John. You know, the quickest thing you can do in your house to save energy, throw away your dryer and use a clothesline. In Colorado, it works beautifully. And it's the simplest thing. It saves you money in the first month, and it's pretty, unless you've got a family of 10, it's pretty doable. So anyway, that's my tidbit for 10%.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, that actually segues really well into our next question, which is the one that we sent you before, which is, what role does policy play in conservation? And I actually tweaked it a bit, or efficiency, because the way I see it is you can have policy targeting conservation in terms of time of day rates, right? Like that targets people's behavior. But then you have policy such as building code that targets building efficiency. So can you speak a little bit to, you know, what role does policy play in sort of looking ahead? What are some policies that CSU and Fort Collins are going to have to incorporate to reach their respective climate goals?
Well, I'll just say my 2 cents is that policy is the quickest way to move fast. We can all make individual choices and it nibbles at the edges, and they're all important. But if you want to really move the needle, 100% renewable electricity by 2030, we made that pledge. The city's now made that pledge. Platte River's made that pledge. That will move the needle faster than anything. And at that, since it's about policy, I'm going to tip it over to John.
Yeah, obviously what's working for local government, I mean, being involved. Even earlier this afternoon, I provided some testimony for a state bill, statewide energy benchmarking bill that's very similar to a policy that we adopted back in 2018 here in Fort Collins. And Carol's right, you know, the things that are, whether it's a policy pledge around carbon or then taking a more specific, looking at 100% renewable electricity, most of the progress we have made in our Fort Collins community emissions since 2005, much of that can be attributed already to changing our electricity mix. And we've got quite a ways to go, but we've made some significant strides in the last few years. But the importance of making policy goals in a way that I've learned, it's important that you can translate those into budgets and programs and services. So One of our earliest versions of a policy goal was great as a metric, but it was terrible for forward-looking planning. And so we reframed it. We learned from that. We reframed our goal into setting sort of annual targets for saving energy through our efficiency portfolio of programs. Suddenly I have a number I can plan to. I can create a plan for that. I can create programs. I can ask for funding. And we now have a very significant set of ongoing efficiency programs that cumulatively are now saving the community about 15% of electricity over what it would have been in absence of all those programs. So it's kind of a slow and steady approach, but it's been very important. And the last one I'll speak to is building codes and energy codes. We are spending resources and money fixing the energy performance of houses that could have been built correctly in the first place. And the sort of lagging nature of creating codes that are really effective and enforcing those codes means that we're spending a lot of money that we wouldn't otherwise have to go back and fix those homes. Now part of that was just a sign of the times that we're in, but there are other things I can say that we knew better. And the best time to make an efficient building is when you first build it, whether that's a building on campus, an office building like I occupy or used to occupy most days, or our homes. And so code improvements almost always pay off. And yet we also have people that are like, well, aren't you happy? I built it to your code, and I tell them something along the lines of, congratulations, you didn't break the law. But we know that we can go much better than code, and with that, maybe I'll hand it to Josie, because code is a minimum performance standard, and we certainly know that we can do much better than that.
So when I think of code and policy, it really takes me back to this notion of systems change. And the way that codes and policies work, John, was talking about how, and Carol too, we're raising the floor. So the minimum acceptable threshold. And it's a great way to bring everyone up from the bottom. And then you also have the innovators and the pioneers who are pushing the ceiling toward what's possible, right? So people have been designing and building with a lot more vigor net zero energy buildings now for the last 10 or 15 years. And they're figuring out how to do that. So those folks are kind of being the pioneers and charting the way for the code changes that are going to come next. And they prove that it's possible. They show the way that can be done. They also end up sometimes paying for some of those mistakes or early learning lessons along the way. But they serve in a tremendous value to the rest of society because they are willing to take those risks. They are willing to be the pioneers. And then the code changes and changes and changes. And so seeing how those dynamics start to work together to shift the whole system, but hopefully as quickly as possible. And so we are starting to see things like net zero energy codes becoming a conversation, whereas I think even just 10 years ago, people were like, no way, that's never going to happen. And yet, to John's point, you build a building and lo and behold, it's here for 50, 100, 150 years. And so doing the work to get it right on the first place is important. And I don't remember the statistics, but Architecture 2030 has some incredible information about both, how much new construction is going to happen in the next 50 years, how much is going to be renovated, and the importance of paying attention to that new construction, those renovations. And codes play a huge role in lifting up the efficiency of all of that building stock in a way that's going to help us meet our carbon reduction goals as a society.
If I could add on a little bit, because again, I spent a lot of time in this space, and to make an analogy to what Carol mentioned earlier about, recycling or composting, as even codes for new construction, if we implemented net zero new construction codes tomorrow, it's not going to do that much for getting to our important climate goals. because of the building stock we already have. Now that'll be different for every community, but we cannot get to our goals without doing the really hard work of addressing the tens of thousands of existing buildings that we already have that were built under all different types of construction and eras and performance levels, and have all of the inherent challenges that come along with doing that. It's much harder in those existing buildings. And the role of policy in existing buildings is something that we're just scratching the surface on in Fort Collins. Examples of that are the benchmarking and performance standards bills for commercial buildings, thinking about how that might apply in the future to residential. But there's probably going to be a lot of pushback against requirements or policy basis for making improvements in existing buildings. And yet at the same time, the math is pretty simple. You can't get there without addressing that significant part of our carbon footprint. So.
And I want to address just a little bit of that, especially in the residential sector. There's a lot of people that push back and say, you keep raising the code, you keep making all these requirements about making buildings more efficient. But yes, there's some truth to that. But if we look at life cycle costs, we just need to figure out how to make sure that everybody can overcome the initial hurdle. But many of you, the students in particular, have probably been in a rental property that cost you an arm and a leg in utilities. And so you have to realize over the life of the building, the initial cost is really a small fraction of the total cost. And operating the building and maintaining the building and all those things are really important. So yes, some of these things might make the first cost a little more expensive, and we need to make sure that we don't leave people out of the equation because of that. And Fort Collins has a terrible affordable housing problem. Oh my Lord, I just got my property tax valuation. So yeah, how do first-time home buyers get a house in Fort Collins, and how can we make that still a good house? The answer is not building a cheap, crummy house, because that burdens them with a lifetime of high utility bills.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And then Matt's going to jump in with our next question.
I could talk about this all day with you guys. This is good, relevant stuff. So I'm going to circle back a little bit to the conservation side. And one of the things that I've seen developing is better ways for utility payers to be aware of their costs, but also translating that into environmental impacts. And I personally kind of see that as a field that can grow a lot. When I look at my utility bills, at least with City of Fort Collins, they let me know how I'm doing compared to my neighbors, which is a nice little competitive way to see if I'm doing better or worse. But I see, I guess, a lot of growth potential for how we can gently coax people into modifying their behavior. Time of day is one of them, but you know, if conservation is as big a deal as we say it is, sometimes I think there's a lack of visibility. Like you're saying, people spend 6 minutes a year looking at this stuff, maybe. So I'm curious if you guys have any insights, technology, or just kind of new things, new ways of approaching the public that could really help on that regard.
Josie, I think you need to go first this time.
Smart choice. Smart choice.
That's a hard question.
Well, I'll just say I have seen products out there, like, you know, you can plug into your outlet and you can have a little amp meter if you want. They're not the cheapest thing, and you got to connect a lot of them if you want to get the full picture, you know, other than plugging into your circuit breaker or something like that. The smart home is still something that is more in the realm of new construction. So, you know, trying to, like you're saying, roll the rest of the community in, just seeing where you see that going.
So you're speaking, some of what you're speaking towards is social science and the social science around behavior change. Mm-hmm. And so the, you know, those on-bill comparisons are grounded in social science about some of what helps to motivate and draw people's attention. Now, clearly it's not drawing everyone's attention, but but people actually do pay attention, and it's evidence-based research that that program is based in and that the city has adopted. Another one, and this isn't again going to apply to everyone, and your point is well made, it's hard to get people's attention. And I think that that happens because there's so many important issues and there's so much life happening, and it is hard to get people's attention. And there are things like one of my, well, our coworkers, Jenny Cross, is a renowned expert in behavior change and social science. And one of the things that her and her group did was evaluate one of the programs that the city was offering for home energy improvements. And what they were doing, and John, you can correct me if I don't get the story quite right, but they were offering free, they were offering home energy audits for a low cost. So they have an auditor come in, they evaluate your whole home, they tell you what you could improve. Now, this probably applies more to a homeowner than a renter, but they do it for business owners, and you can have that service if, say, I were to own a multifamily apartment building or something like that. They'll come in, they do an assessment, and they tell you, here's the best ways to improve your energy efficiency. And then the city has some financing where they can help you pay for those improvements and even pay for them with the savings that you get off the bill. One of the things that they found was that homeowners were really overwhelmed when they got this long list of 25 things that they might do to improve their energy efficiency, and they didn't know how to pick what to do or what it was. And so then what they discovered through, again, social science and understanding barriers was to create packages, and they would create a good, better, best package. So then I didn't have to try to figure it all out on my own as a homeowner. I could just say, oh, give me that package, give me that thing. and it was directly dealing with the barriers that people had around being overwhelmed with the decision making. And it turned out that something like 60 or 70% of the people would choose the better or best option. So given the choice and being able to do the comparison, they would actually upsell themselves. Now, that's one really specific example, and clearly that's for people who, are willing to get a home energy audit, who are paying attention to the mailers, they were willing to make a call, all that kind of stuff. But you can use social science to help understand what are the barriers for given groups and to try to create targeted messages and pathways that make it easier for people to make good choices.
And I'm going to weigh in a little bit on the commercial side, because this is a question I struggle with. If anybody has a good answer to this question, I'll take it. At the university, the departments do not pay their own utility bills. So whoever lives in the chemistry building and works in the chemistry building has no idea that the old chemistry building eats about $900,000 a year worth of utilities. That's all in, that's all utilities. But darn near, it's close to $1 million a year to run the chemistry building on campus. Do the people that work in chemistry know that? They don't. And so when you try to do behavior change, when you at a residential level, the example Josie just gave, I can choose the best option because I will save on my utility bills. At the university, and I'm using this personally because this is what I know, but this is true in almost any commercial building. The people that occupy that building probably have no idea what it costs to run that building. So when you ask them, hey, can you turn out the lights? You're like, really? Lights in one building on a campus that has 12.5 million square feet? Really? How much am I going to change? Well, if everybody did it, if 30,000 people did it, we'll move the needle. If one person does it, no, we can't see it. But there is definitely a disconnect between the people that know what the utility bills cost, and I will put myself in that category, and the people that live and work in most of our buildings. And that disconnect is pretty big. And I've tried to close that gap in a variety of ways, and I have not been successful. So any suggestions? Bring them my way.
A great question, Matt. And already you can tell from the responses how little we've talked about technology and how much we've talked about people So ultimately, it is always people making decisions. Whether you're making a decision to do an efficiency upgrade on your home, like Josie was talking about it, whether you're making a decision to like use the light switch that is on the wall already, or whether you're making a decision to know that the time of day pricing structure changed last week, or no, earlier this week, on Monday of this week, it changed to summer hours from what it was before. And
I was wondering about that, John. Sure.
There you go.
I missed the boat, huh?
It is the month of May. So we got another 18 minutes or so, it looks like, and then we'll be outside.
Go do your laundry.
The peak window. So, the time of day is a fascinating thing to study. And we've actually also had some pretty rigorous studies on that, because we were one of the first utilities to do it as like the default rate structure. So it was like, we switched over everyone and said, congratulations, here's your new price structure. Some of the things we learned in that is, at first, I think our communications folks were like, we really need to make sure people know that it's expensive for a few hours a day. And the response was, oh my God, you raised everything is now 3 times more expensive. And it's 3 times more expensive for 4 hours a day. And it's 30% cheaper for 20 hours a day. Like, which one do you want to focus on? And so it was also just a classic example in how we frame things, the sort of choice architecture, sometimes it's called, if you're making choices. But to the other example, I know you were talking about the actual devices that, so we actually have devices, you can check them out from the library, and it'll pair to your electric meter in Fort Collins, and it'll give you a real-time data stream of exactly how many watts your power draw is at any given time. And it's fascinating for geeks in general, but even for non-geeks. But it's fascinating what we found for a pretty short period of time. So we came up with a term, it was called the time to drawer. It was like how long it actually stayed on the counter versus when people got tired of it and they just stick it in a drawer because they don't want to look at it anymore. And you start to see your own patterns, and it's useful to understand those patterns, but then it ceases to become sort of actionable for most people after a pretty short time. And again, we come back to the social science and psychology of it. So we've gone down the path of making them available so people can use them for a short period of time, learn about their behaviors and use. And then I'll throw my one nerdy engineer pet peeve, which is we're typically obsessed with how the maximum that we're using. But if you want to look at energy conservation, look at the minimum amount. So energy at 3 a.m, when you think nothing is happening in your house, you're wasting it for sure. And you're wasting it 24 hours a day. And so that's a great opportunity to look at finding those things that are plugged in and not providing any value to you, perhaps. So.
Yeah, there's a lot in that. Human behavior, huh? That's a
well,
and
Matt, let me tell a quick story to add to John's point.
Please do.
I had a friend who was a nerdy engineer type, and he measured every electrical load in his house, and there was over 90. He included his doorbell. Okay, this is how big he went down. But you're like, where does it go? And John, the biggest thing in his house, this shows how dated this story is. It was a DVR. It was a TiVo device. It was drawing 50 watts, 24/7, 365, and was the biggest impact on his total electric usage. So it can be the dumbest thing you think of, but things like that can add up.
Wow. Yeah, listening to everything you said, first I'm going to go check out the device this coming week. So that's cool to know. I've been wanting that for a long time. But, there's that struggle of, if you put something in front of people, like they need to be able to measure it so that they can act on it, right? But people also get worn out. So there's that fine line of how much you put in front of them constantly until they just ignore it again. So I certainly appreciate the challenge with trying to change it. But yeah, that's all really interesting to hear.
Let me add one more piece on sort of visibility and transparency. And it's the long game, thinking about real estate markets and investment. And so part of our drive for scoring the building performance on commercial buildings, and we also have new certificates available for residential buildings, is that over time that will become normal, that people are going to look at, if I'm going to rent an apartment or lease a space in a commercial building, or I'm going to buy a building or buy a house, that you will want to see what the energy performance of that is. And it becomes part of the transaction. Yeah, it becomes part of the transaction, and the valuation that comes from that will come from the market, and then ultimately that will drive very significant levels of investment and influence as people see the value that is invisible right now. So you can't see the insulation in your house. You don't know how it is, but if we can make that invisible visible, then that's kind of a long game to play on really building a foundation for improving really that sort of thousands of houses and buildings. But it's still about transparency and information.
Yeah. Thank you all. That was great.
Yeah, and that leads really well into our last script question that we have, and then we'll get into audience Q&A. So our last question is, what can audience members on this call, so residents of Fort Collins, probably a lot of us are students, so renters, what can we do to kind of better line up with these goals, or better conserve our building energy? What are some, we've definitely mentioned a couple already in the call, but what are some of those go-tos? And then for those of us, I know there's a bunch of engineers on the call, and then a bunch of sustainability minded people as well. Moving forward, what can builders, architects, that kind of thing, what can those types of people be doing too?
All right, I'm going to try to answer quickly, and I want to encourage all of us too, because there's some great questions in the chat too, and I want to make sure we can get to a couple of those. John said it when he said, be mindful, and it's kind of harder than you think, but what we pay attention to matters. If you start paying attention to it and getting other people to pay attention to it, then you can make a difference. So, buy yourself your own pack of LED light bulbs and take them with you from house to house if you need to, from an investment perspective. In the summer, manage your heat, your cooling load by letting your house air out at night and then close it all up first thing in the morning. Draw the blinds to keep the direct sunlight out. Find those inexpensive ways. It's the old, Jimmy Carter thing, throw on a sweater in the winter or use a rice bag. Look for those ways to, just blow a fan on you instead of turning on the AC. All of those are free or nearly free things that you can do. They'll save you energy, and it'll help cut down on this really, as Carol sort of said, it doesn't maybe get all the attention, but it's where the action is as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned.
Well, I'll just do my commercial building spiel, because you touched a lot of and I've already told you the dryer, clothesline, first easy thing, right? In commercial buildings, if you're an architect, get the envelope right. We can do a lot of retrofitting in a building. We can't retrofit the envelope, the skin of the building. Make sure it doesn't leak, make sure you've got good R value, all those things. Anything else I can fix. I can replace HVAC equipment, I can replace lighting. I can't fix the skin of a building. So
don't overglaze it.
Yeah, don't.
Too many windows. Don't put on too many windows.
I'm not.
I said it for you.
Now before I say something I shouldn't.
Yes, windows, you can have extraordinary views and daylighting without excessive windows. If you're not sure of that, come visit in our building downtown, or a bunch of other great examples we have around town. So
I'm on it, get away.
Uh-oh.
I would say, so we talked a little bit about things at home, being mindful, what to do in commercial building. Consider yourself as a consumer if you're renting. So you're probably making choices you have. It may not make a difference in your immediate one, but if you start asking, like, what's the energy performance of this home or this apartment that you're looking at? And that starts to become something people hear about, or they can't answer it, or maybe a few of them can. That sort of consumer pull eventually does have an impact. So while the rental market here is of course crazy now, as it has been for quite a few years, it hasn't always been that way. So making those landlords, property managers compete for your business based on energy as one of the criteria that you're looking for, along with all the other things that matter, can start to drive things as well. And so if you're living in a house and you know the landlord and you're not afraid to ask them something, say, hey, why don't you contact Epic Homes program and get an energy assessment of this house, and be a willing participant, because it's a little bit of, you have to have people tromping through the house, and if they decide to do some work, you may need some contractors in it, but be a willing participant in that. I'll put in a pitch. We're actively seeking rental homes, both for improvements, but also we're working with a professor at CSU on an indoor environmental quality study of rental homes that are going through before and after efficiency projects, and helping to really demonstrate and gather the data as the foundation to show the connection between energy efficiency improvements and health and well-being, comfort and safety in the homes. And so we'd love to get some more rental homes into the project.
Awesome. Well, I think we're going to go to Q&A because Josie said it. We have some really awesome questions in there. So I'll hand it over to Ben to walk us through this.
Great. Yeah. So we have a couple really interesting topics that some folks brought up, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts on these pieces. So one of the first questions that we have is related to kind of the energy use and then also the embodied carbon aspects of a building in general. And so I'm hoping to get your thoughts on what are kind of some tools that we can use for both of those two different categories independently.
You're muted, Carol.
I'm muted. I was trying to pass off to you, Josie, is actually what I was trying to do. But I will just say embodied carbon, we've understood, let's try that better. Understood operational carbon, which is what we've done a footprint on for the university for well over a decade, almost 15 years. But understanding embodied carbon, the data hasn't been there as long, and we're understanding it better now and making choices as when is it better to tear a building down or when is it better to refurbish it? And there's a lot of things in that. But basically embodied carbon is that there's already a lot of carbon energy embodied in the parts of that building. So do we keep that, or is it, 1960s R3 and it just needs to go? We make those choices every day and we're understanding them better, but I do not profess to be an expert.
There was a really great study by the New Buildings Institute, and it was a number of years back at this point. It might be a 10-year-old study or better, but they did look at the difference between embodied carbon in existing buildings versus building a new efficient building. And actually, in most cases, you're probably better off retrofitting the existing building than building new, if that's a choice. That's not always the choice that we have to make. But when there's an option to reuse, it's typically a good carbon choice. And then you also have the Living Building Challenge, which is a really aggressive building standard, and they include embodied carbon as part of the calculation for the environmental impact of the building. And you buy essentially a one-time carbon offset to make up for the embodied carbon in your new construction. And that includes the materials and all the energy that went into the construction of the building. So there are ways to think about and calculate that. It's a very small fraction of the world that is thinking and working on that, but it is possible, and it is part of the conversation.
Yeah. I'd say it's not exactly embodied carbon, but maybe analogous to it is, Carol mentioned the type of carbon inventory that CSU does, and the Fort Collins sort of community inventory is similarly structured around sort of an annual snapshot of sort of inputs and outputs, and with a boundary drawn loosely around the community. There are other ways of doing carbon inventories, and we're sort of exploring them, and they're generally spoken more as a consumption-based inventory. So it would actually capture the life cycle of sort of what does it take for all of the materials, not only the energy we use, but also the materials that we purchase, how they got here, what kind of packaging they were in, what happens, where they were manufactured, how they were manufactured. It's a much more complex and rich area, and we're thinking we may try to bring some aspects of that into some of our carbon reporting in order to be more complete. It really, I think they complement each other. They tell you different parts of the story around our impact on climate and the globe. Again, it's kind of analogous to the embodied carbon discussion specific to buildings. So.
I'll throw out the term life cycle analysis. That's one of the ways that we figure out embodied carbon within building materials.
Right. And there's a lot of data available today that wasn't easily available a decade ago about what the difference in embodied carbon in different kinds of concrete, different kinds of carpet, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I know LCA topics are the amount of data out there for those sorts of things is growing, which is great to see, and is a really useful tool for this sort of thing for sure. So another thing that I wanted to bring up that's kind of an interesting nuance of all this stuff is how these topics kind of intertwine with environmental and social justice in buildings. And I guess I just wanted to hear your opinions and experiences with how building energy intertwines with these topics, and how you see those topics playing in the future as we try to make improvements in this area.
Well, you can't divorce them, is the short answer. And I'll just throw that out there, is that you have to lift all boats. That's an old phrase, but if we don't bring everybody along, if we don't save the whole planet, it doesn't matter if you make a gated community and save your community. Without bringing everybody along, you've lost the battle. So we need to make sure that, whatever we do, we joke about CSU leads in a lot of sustainability metrics, but we want to bring everybody else along, because this isn't a win or lose game. I mean, we all have to win or everybody loses.
I see the ways that justice, both environmental and social, play out in the built environment as being usually centered around broader land use as well as neighborhoods. So thinking about the folks who live in and around Commerce City and the amount of air pollution that they experience that leads to, asthma and other respiratory and health issues. Typically the lowest income communities, which are often communities of color, end up living in the most polluted places. And so there are land use concerns and issues that have to do with long-term economic patterns and trends. And then the homes that low-income families and households live in often suffer from poor indoor air quality, health and safety, ventilation. They also tend to have the highest energy bills. And so when we're looking for places to start, I think that it's really important that we see where the most impact can happen. And often those things all collide at the intersection of environmental and social justice. And so if we can work to improve people's lives, improve their energy efficiency, improve their indoor air quality, and to do all of that simultaneously, there are so many wins and so many opportunities there that I think it's a place that deserves a disproportionately high amount of our attention. And yet it's also often disproportionately difficult to figure out the solutions within those communities. So it is a complicated and complex challenge that deserves all of our attention.
Both of you. Point books, take a look at the new Our Climate Future Plan that we just got adopted by City Council. So the first planning effort of the city intentionally with centered on equity and leading with race. From those historically underrepresented groups. Oh, I've lost. Am I back?
You unfroze. Okay. Yeah.
Am I back now?
Looks like it. Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. It was brilliant, whatever I said. So,
sorry we missed it, John. You sound like you're onto something good.
The importance of hearing directly from those historically underrepresented groups as we think about and design, but also looking for leadership in different areas of aspects of the community. So yes, as Josie pointed out, the barriers to making changes are tremendous sometimes. And yet if we can address the barriers of those that face the greatest barriers, we're also going to address barriers for everybody else. And there has certainly been a gap in much of the city's work in terms of focusing on sort of easier to get to. Think of single family owner occupied homes. Yeah, that's great. That's important. But we're missing a tremendous part of the community by not effectively reaching into the rental space as one example. And then of course, rental spaces going to have a higher fraction of those people of color, lower socioeconomic status groups. And so there's a bias that's built in there. And so the work we're doing this year is starting with really reviewing our existing programs and services and understanding how they are or are not driving to the outcomes that we're after. Lastly, I'd say that the data, we're extremely comfortable and have very mature understanding of energy and the buildings and the physical characteristics of those buildings, when they were built, and all kinds of factors. We are just scratching the surface of understanding how to interpret and use demographic data at the household level in our community to help improve our delivery of services and understand how that information can be used in a fair and equitable way. So it's a great area of work that we're just getting started on.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an important area that, there's lots to be done in for sure. So, one other one that I wanted to mention here that I think is interesting is when we have decisions to make that kind of put energy and conservation and efficiency at odds with things like biodiversity and land use and other topics like that. How do you all see kind of those decisions being made, and how is the balance between those sorts of things struck when they are at odds with each other?
John, I think it's your turn to go first.
Looks like I locked up again. There we go.
Now you're just using that as a way to get out of answering questions.
I was going to say we called Josie to help us her excellent facilitation skills to get through the conversation. You know, I think there's a variety of tools out there that can really try to compare. You know, we often talk about trade-offs. The classic is the triple bottom line. We have to, you know, make trade-offs between economic, environmental, and social outcomes. Many times in my experience, that can be a false structure to start out with. We assume sort of quite a bit when we're start out with that framework even, and that oftentimes we can find solutions that are beneficial in all three of those areas in that case. I think that the sourcing of energy in particular is one that probably this comes up a lot. So we had an example last year. We installed a 225 megawatt wind system just north of the Colorado border in southern Wyoming. It's a fantastic place to put a wind farm, tremendous resource. And we had to build a transmission line across a ranch that utilities owns that's right next to the soapstone, which is a natural area, an open space, and actually impacted the view shed. It wasn't on the natural area. We obviously wouldn't do that, but it impacts sort of the visual view shed there. And had to have a lot of conversation that there's no right answer there. Is the benefit of having a significant increase in our wind, a reduction in our carbon emissions, a fair trade-off for building a road and a transmission line through what was otherwise kind of open ranch land and adjacent to open space? And I think the only way is through some deep conversations, and that's what I got.
I'll just say that we're working on the land use issue. Renewables by their nature are more diffuse than fossil fuels. There's a reason we burned oil and gas and coal for a long time. It's pretty easy stuff, really concentrated. You're not having as big an impact, whereas solar, you might have to cover acres with panels. But one of our next round of solar projects that are just underway right now, one of them will be in a sheep pasture up at our agricultural campus. And from everything we understand, the sheep are happier, the pasture is healthier with the shade provided by the solar. And so maybe there's good ways that we can overcome some of those land use impacts. It doesn't address the biodiversity, whatever, but if it was a sheep pasture when we got there and we made it a better sheep pasture when we left by putting solar in it, then it's a gain. So we're trying to make ways that we're including more things in those projects than excluding. So talk to me again in a year or two and I'll let you know how the sheep are doing under our panel.
It's an interesting project for sure. Yeah. So I'm going to tap Matt in. He's got a couple more questions for you all from our audience here. And yeah, take it away, Matt.
Okay, so I'm just going to lead you all with one of the questions from the chat. So Anthony asks, is Fort Collins likely to meet its greenhouse gas reduction goal by 2030? Is it possible to reach that goal without significant government investment and regulation? If you want, we can limit this to what's expected in the plan for buildings.
I missed whether that was the carbon goal or the
greenhouse gas, greenhouse gas reduction goal, yeah.
My personal opinion, so we've just the plan that we just put together modeled out actually achieving that 80% reduction goal with about 100 different tactics and strategies that we call next moves in that plan. The supply side on the electricity is assumed. We're going to make it to 100% renewable electricity in that scenario. And it still requires tremendous changes in reductions in natural gas use in the community, and reduction and conversion of petroleum transportation, electrifying our transportation system to a pretty significant degree. And I think of all of those, the natural gas is going to be the most challenging to make that change in the time frame that we have. So it's natural gas is cheap, ubiquitous, really concentrated energy. It's in over 90% of our homes have natural gas fired water heaters and furnaces. So many tens of thousands of appliances need to be replaced with the technology that exists today. It works well, and nobody's asking for it. And our contractor base is not necessarily very comfortable selling and installing. So we've got to make a complete shift in the marketplace for those. And even more challenging will be some of the commercial and industrial uses for natural gas. But that's going to be the hardest nut to crack, so to speak, in that. And whether we can do it without any sort of regulations, I don't know. I think it would either require some pretty significant incentives or probably some requirements to get there.
Josie, Karen?
That's all John.
Pass.
Yeah, we can't. It's
I'll
not.
pass.
Good
It's
deal.
not for
Yeah.
us to say.
And if anybody
That's
wants
fair.
to come up with a really great commercial rooftop unit that does that operates as a heat pump, there's none of them out there, and so there's like a massive gap in the sort of technology for that particular sort of classic commercial heating and cooling device out there.
Wow. Okay, well, we've got one more. Josie, this one might be best for you. So Kevin asks, what kind of ways can students influence policy development to encourage sustainable development? Often these projects are big and or long-term, but there's a cyclic nature to many residents who are here for just a few years for school.
So I was actually just typing out a response to that one. So I would actually say the city in general doesn't hear enough of the student voice. And I think, students are often consumed in their lives of becoming young adults and getting their education, and their focus isn't on civic engagement. It seems to be something that people become more interested in as they get older. Now, not exclusively, I know there are young people who are engaged and who do show up, but I would say show up, like start figuring out and finding out the ways where you can attend planning and zoning meetings and council meetings. I mean, I don't know how many students that sounds like really exciting for, right? Like I used to make fun of my mom for watching council, and now like I find myself doing it sometimes. And I've testified, in front of council on a few different occasions. But the community would really like to hear the student voice more. And so if there, is a political science group or a sustainability group, and you can get together and, see what issues are going to be on the agendas or see what opportunities there are for engagement. There's all kinds of engagement opportunities. And the community actually really does want to hear the student voice, but it's hard to get. And some of that's, I'll say, our responsibility, because I do a fair bit of community engagement and outreach to, go to the community and draw people in, not just expect the community to come and engage themselves, right? That's hard to do, and we get that. And so some of the responsibility, I think, is on those of us who are civil servants, and either formally as John is, or sort of informally as I may be, to get that voice. But if you're interested, check out where planning and zoning meetings are. Check out what the various plans are that are happening whenever they're happening, whether that's city plan or a transportation plan or a corridor plan, and be available, because the student voice is wanted and can be tricky. It's a two-way street. It's hard to know, I think, as a student how to engage, but I think from the flip side, it's like hard to get students to be interested. So I guess that feels like maybe sort of a flat answer, but
no, that's fair. I mean,
well,
I don't see flyers around campus for these, but that, yeah, I get it.
Matt, I want to add to that because first of all, this is a SOJES presentation, so I got to put in a plug for the SSC, which is the Student Sustainability Center, which is an umbrella organization that helps link sustainability clubs across campus. So whether you're trying to ban the plastic bottle or you want more composting on campus or whatever, there's a club for that. Trust me, we have dozens of them. So if you can find, like, you want to get into the bee thing, you know, hey, I want to be an apiariist, right? We have lots of that on campus. So find your like-minded students and connect with them, and then do some of that policy work that Josie's talking about. And I love to tell this story. CSU signed the Climate Reality Pledge, 100% renewable electricity by 2030, in January of 2017. And at the time, the city and Platte River were kind of like, how are you guys going to do this? What are you doing? What? But the reason that happened is there was a club of students. They got 4,000 signatures that took it through the front door of the admin building. And I joke, Tony Frank was president at the time. He sneaks out the back door and comes over to facilities and said, is this going to break the university? Should we sign this? And we do a little analysis over here, a group of us, send it back to Tony. He's like, oh, this is okay. So he goes and he signs this. But if the students hadn't come in the front door with those 4,000 signatures, I could have pounded on the back door of the admin building all day. And Tony Frank had a lot of stuff going on. And frankly, I can't make that initial step, but the students can, okay? And so do not underestimate your power of influencing the president, because that's really powerful voice on the university. And then when we made that pledge in 2017, in 2018, the city came around and Platte River came around and made the same pledge. And so the students ultimately drove that initiative by pushing it on campus, that then pushed it in the community. So do not discount that.
Yeah, the next extension of that story is Colorado State University is our single largest customer. And now if you take the campus writ large of all the employees, staff, students, it is easily by far and so that pledge helps sort of put it on the map for the city to make that policy, but then drives to Platte River. And so that's a great example, Carol, of building from the bottom and driving change. Matt, I'll give you another example. You can go sit down with one of our city council members and talk to them. I can't do that as a staff person, but residents in the community, you can go to their listening sessions. You can try to get a hold of them, and many of them will sit down with community stakeholders and have a conversation. And that I have seen that sort of grassroots engagement and organizing directly with our leadership make tremendous difference in decisions that are made. And then, yeah, like Carol got the Tony Frank running to them, we get somebody from staff or the city manager's office running to us and say, like, what does this mean? Can we, like, are we in trouble if we do this? So then we do the sort of back checking and get back to them. So
that's really incredible. I mean, it's something I can speak to, the feeling coming from a even bigger city, that feeling of like, is my voice really going to be, heard, and how far will it go? It, for one, feels different in Fort Collins, but these stories are definitely encouraging, to say the least.
One other thing that's some recent changes to the structure. Council has 20 some odd advisory boards, and they advise council on various topics. There's an energy board, water board, many others. They've made some adjustments in some of the terms of those that should make it easier for students perhaps to apply and get on one of those boards. They used to have kind of really long terms, and you had to be able to make a commitment for a period of time that might be difficult for a student or sometimes for regular community members. And so the intention is to diversify those boards and commissions to allow more participation, and might be something else to take a look at. So.
And awesome professional development. I mean, how cool to put that on a resume.
There you go.
So I think I'm going to wrap this up with one last question. And this could be an entire topic on its own, but the question's gone here now, but I'm going to summarize it. But it's a question about generally tiny homes and smaller homes in general. One of the questions came from someone who is from Japan, and he noted that homes here are big, much bigger than many other places. And I think if anyone who travels the world at all, that is immediately evident. So I think there's a lot, this question could go a lot of different directions. But I guess one way I take it is, what place do you see maybe tiny homes or, new smaller homes that could play in all of this? And this, I understand, really wraps into human behavior again with what people want, and you can't really change that. So, but I'll see which direction you guys would like to take that.
So John, I might like to speak to the recent Metro Districts policy that was passed.
Sure.
So Metro Districts are a little complicated. I won't get into it, but it's basically a special tax district. I'm not going to go into that. The point is that most of the large scale new residential development that's going to happen in Fort Collins, a lot of that will happen as a Metro District. And the city of Fort Collins just passed a piece of legislation that would kind of regulate or require that Metro Districts meet certain standards to help us meet our ambitions. Because right now we have ambitions as a community as written through city plan and our climate future and a number of other plans, our transportation plan, our housing plan, and then we have code. And there's actually a gap today between what's allowable by code and meeting our goals. So what this was intended to do is to help close the gap and say, if you want this extra funding mechanism available to you, you have to meet these standards. And one of the big things was about providing housing for what they call the missing middle. And the missing middle are lower or below average income earners, maybe not those who'd qualify for federal assisted housing, but people who make less than average and they need homes. Well, one of the best ways to create permanently affordable homes is to create smaller units. And so that was one of the strategies that we used in the Metro District's requirements, was to say you need to build a certain percentage of your homes that are smaller than these big homes, because Fort Collins actually has some of the biggest homes around. Our average home size is among the biggest in the country. And so so that observation is very astute. And it's not that people don't want them. People actually want them. We just need, right. Right. It's young professionals, it's empty nesters, it's like small families, people, maybe two people with one kid, or a single parent and a kid. And so we're trying to look for some policy ways to incentivize smaller home options that also provide affordability for residents, and they always will sell for less than a bigger home. So it's permanent affordability, it's less footprint, and yes, it's important from a lot of different perspectives.
Right, because one of the challenges is incentivizing developers, right? I mean, big, expensive homes are very attractive.
They make bigger margins. The real estate agents make bigger margins. It's the system is not designed to encourage small houses, but I also want to go back to that comment about embodied carbon. If you take the materials to build a ginormous house, a ranchette, as we affectionately call them, and with a 2-acre yard, that you could make 4 houses out of that would easily, 3 maybe, but some of them are pretty huge. But yes, it is an interesting. The financial system and the real estate system is not really designed to encourage smaller. But I think affordable housing will drive it there, because frankly, my daughter lives in a 1,000 square foot house that the tax assessor just said was worth almost $300,000. And that's a 1,000 square foot house. And actually, it doesn't even have a garage anymore because part of the 1,000 square feet is we added a room out in the garage. So yeah, it's pretty hard to think about how a young family buys a home in this community.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where, I know we just got a couple minutes left, but the role of planning, zoning, whether it's metro districts, the land use code, really thinking about density and what's allowed. There's actually a lot of power in that to change how some of the development happens. And yeah, the bias historically has been for sort of meeting what people want and what works for the developers and things like that. And yet Fort Collins, in my view, I grew up in some bigger cities and bigger places, and Fort Collins sort of thinks it's still a small town that maybe is growing on the edges, and needs to sort of grow in, build better transportation systems. You know, it's really the connection between, one of the reasons our climate future has housing and transit and energy and waste, you know, and many other topics built in, is because it is all interconnected. And some of the, as we build buildings, we'll go back to Josie said, they're going to be there for 50 or 100 years or more. And so trying to get it right the first time is certainly the best approach. And size definitely matters. Either that, or we just put a lot more people in the big houses. I don't know if we can do that one. But.
Oh, well, you got to get rid of U+2.
U+2, right?
U+2 is the worst thing this town has ever done for sustainability, because we got big houses that they technically only allow 3 people in. So that's my little tidbit.
I will speak personally.
I'll give you a preview. So the topic of U+2 or replacement of that with different types of rental licensing and that is on the radar. So
a great way to get involved.
That is
a great way to get involved.
Students,
so,
yes.
And think about it as like not just U+2 going away, but what would work in place of U+2 that would keep the quality and character of neighborhoods and allow for the density that we all need and addressing some of the housing affordability issues. So
it's like U+2, the limit has to be on the number of cars, not the number of humans.
I like it. Well, thank you guys for answering all those questions. I'll hand it over to Audrey.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for attending. Dr. Lockwood put a great comment in that says the world belongs to those who show up. And so we really appreciate you guys showing up, and we really appreciate all of our audience members for showing up, and we super appreciate Sojas for helping us get the Zoom together, get all of our advertising out. So yeah, it was really great. Thanks again. You guys totally volunteered your time, and that's really cool. So with that, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, it was awesome to have you all.
Thank you all. That was very educational.
Yeah.
Awesome.